Need your daily fix on mixed martial arts?
We're going to kind of recap Bellator 155.
From UFC 198.
Who's who?
Kind of a controversial decision.
And who's not?
I couldn't figure out why, and then it hit me.
Well, don't you fret, because Golden State Media Concepts got you covered. Get your daily dose of MMA podcasts. Everything from the UFC, Bellator Fighting Championships, Extreme Cage Fighting, Invicta Fighting Championships, and so much more. Join us as we talk about some of the biggest names in mixed martial arts. We've got you covered here on Golden State Media Concepts MMA Podcast.
Thank you for tuning in to the Golden State Media Concepts Mixed Martial Arts Podcast. I'm your host, Tate, and today we're going to do something a little different. I know there's been a lot of talk and a lot of clamoring over the fact that there's a lot of things going on in the UFC and the mixed martial arts worlds, from the exciting UFC 205 card that's going to be in New York to Ronda Rousey coming back. There's so many things, there's so much things that you can talk about and concentrate, that there's a few things that are going on in the UFC world or the MMA world that is kind of being missed. And one of the big things is the fact that there's a group of fighters that are outright legends are either saying goodbye to the UFC or the UFC is saying bye to them. And I wanted to just kind of touch on that a little bit. So we're going to talk about those guys and some other UFC news today. The first person we're going to talk about, though, is a guy that he may not have been a UFC champion, but this guy is a straight legend. And this week he announced that he is going to retire. And, and so I wanted to start off, especially because our show is based out of Sacramento, California here. So I wanted to start off by talking about the legend who announced that he's going to retire. And I know a lot of people may disagree with me on this one, but he is a legend. That is Urijah Faber. Urijah has announced that after the UFC on Fox 22 card that's going to be in Sacramento, that this will be his final fight and that he will be leaving and retiring. And this is something that I just did not want to let pass as just kind of a footnote, because this guy has been one of the greatest ambassadors to the mixed martial arts world for a very long time. He's huge here in Sacramento. He's huge across the country, and he's one of those fighters that's always been a fan friendly guy, and have nothing but great things to say about him. So he announced that he'll be fighting on UFC on Fox 22 card against Brad Pickett, and that's going to be his final fight. And I don't know if a lot of you already know who Urijah Faber is and know what he's done, but some people may not realize. Urijah Faber, he came in as as a young up and coming star who kind of set the MMA world on fire and quickly rose. He won a number of minor championships, and then he rose to the top of the mixed martial arts world, where he became the WEC featherweight champion. And he was a fighting champion. He was one of the top fighters in WEC. He was that guy that you had to show up to see. He was champion from 2006 to 2008, and I believe he defended his title 5 times. No, I think it was 4. He defended the title 4 times. But, he was one of those champions that, when you're watching WEC, you couldn't wait to see Urijah fight. And over the years, you look around and you look at Urijah's career, and the one thing that always sticks out in a lot of people's mind is the big grudge match and the big grudge, the big competition between Urijah Faber and Dominic Cruz. And you think about how these fights have gone on. They have been some of the best fights of all time. But in the end, Dominic Cruz ended up winning the match where they just had their rubber match at UFC 199, where Dominic won, and there ended up being Cruz 1-2, Urijah 1-1. But when I think about Urijah Faber and I think about all that he did over at WEC, and then coming to the UFC and always being constantly a title contender, fighting for the title 4 different times, and came very close a couple of times to becoming a UFC champion. But his legacy is way more than just what he did in the ring. Urijah has been this ambassador who has held the UFC up to, and kept the UFC up to a great standard where you were proud to have someone like him representing the UFC. The thing that I like best about him is he was the guy that introduced so many great fighters to mixed martial arts. He created Team Alpha Male here in Sacramento, and he's brought in numerous local fighters that a lot of people don't even know. And then there's a number of fighters that are, some of the who's who of mixed martial arts he has worked with and brought their careers along. And that's his legacy. That's the legacy that I think he should be most proud of. You should be very proud of his legacy in the ring, but his legacy outside the ring is second to none. Bringing in guys who could be the next champion, like Cody Garbrandt, Chad Mendez, Paige Van Zandt. For a long time, him and TJ Dillashaw were very tight, and that kind of ended kind of poorly. Chad Mendez, he has brought on some of the who's who of the bantamweight, featherweight, lightweight divisions. These guys have all been been title contenders, or they're about to become major title contenders. He's brought on so many guys. And that's the thing that I think so many people may have missed when it comes to Urijah, that a lot of fighters will have a singular focus, and that is, it's about me, it's about my career, and I don't care about anyone else. But the thing with Urijah had a monstrous heart in the ring and out of the ring. And he spent so much time helping fighters get to the top that I think sometime it kind of even affected his career, where I think if he had more of a singular focus, maybe he would have been a UFC champion. But I'm proud of the way he ran his career and all the things that he did in Sacramento by helping a lot of people kind of, get off the street, learn a skill, and become a professional fighter and reach their dream. And so for that, one of the first fighters the first fighter of tonight that I would like to tip my hat to is Urijah Faber. And I will be at the UFC on Fox 22 card. I'll be there. And I hope he goes out with a win. But win, lose, or draw, this guy is a champion, and it doesn't matter what division he's in. He's a champion in life. And I'm very happy to say that he's been part of the sport that I love the most, and that is mixed martial arts. Okay, so when we come back, I'm going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to talk about the other guy who has been a big name and it's a huge, huge story that's going on. And he just recently stated that he's a free agent. And that is George St-Pierre. So when we come back, we'll be talking a little bit more about a guy who may be leaving the UFC, And he says, he's a free agent. So we'll talk about that when we come right back. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Okay, we're back. And we were just talking about Urijah Faber, a guy who just announced this week that he will have his last fight in the UFC and that he's going to retire at UFC on Fox 22, where he'll fight one last fight and then he's done. And so we were just talking about a little bit about Urijah Faber's career and that, his career was more than just in the ring, but he's had such a big impact on people outside the ring. There's another guy that is very similar to Urijah Faber as far as handling himself at the utmost, highest level of professionalism. And that is maybe arguably one of the top 3 to 5 fighters in the history of the UFC, and that is George St-Pierre. GSP has been nothing but an ambassador and nothing but a class act. And I was really excited when they first started talking about that George was thinking about coming back and returning to the UFC. And then, I saw a couple of interviews where Dana was saying, he doesn't think that George really wants to come back. And so it was kind of a lot of mixed feelings. And I kept seeing a number of interviews and listening to what he has to say. And a lot of those interviews were on Ara Hawani's show, which is, I've mentioned a number of times, I listened to the show. I think it's a great show. But this last interview where George was talking about how he wanted to come back, but the UFC has been kind of giving him a roadblock in that he has kind of declared himself a free agent and free to go anywhere he wants to. As much as I would hate to see him leave the UFC, and 2, I think the UFC would be crazy to let him go. I don't think it will ever happen. He will not be a free agent. I don't think he should even try it. And the reason why that is I go back and I think about a guy who was at the tail end of his career, who tried to do kind of something similar where he wanted to end it. He wanted to get out of his contract to finish his career the way he wanted, which was Randy Couture. And Randy is the Hall of Famer. He fought the UFC and he wanted to get out of his contract. And in the end, he spent, and this is Randy's words, Randy spent almost a little over $500,000 fighting the UFC only to lose and not be able to get out of his contract. And that was a number of years ago. In today's world, in order for GSP to even come close to getting out of his contract, he's going to have to fight the UFC, and he's going to have to spend millions and millions of dollars to get out, to find a loophole. And I don't think he will. The contract has already stood the test of time in court when it was contested against Randy Couture, and so I don't think GSP really has a shot. And so with that, I'm hoping that there's a couple things that can happen. I still hold out hope that the UFC and then GSP can come together, work out an agreement. There's still time that, things can heal and there's still enough time that you could actually put GSP on that Toronto card, which definitely needs a lot of help. This card is very weak. It would really be boosted by bringing in a George St-Pierre. George is one of those fighters that is a major needle mover. He's one of the most popular fighters in the history of the UFC, and I hate the fact that we're even talking about him on this episode of guys who are planning on leaving the UFC or who may never come back. So when you look at this, the biggest issue I think between GSP and the UFC is the Adidas agreement. GSP's contract was before the Adidas agreement, and I think he has a legitimate claim to the fact that, he makes a lot of money off of his endorsements. And the UFC wants to change his contract so that, he has to abide to the Adidas agreement. I think the best solution, and I think this would be a big compromise between the two. I would love to see a situation where you have GSP. He comes to the ring. He wears his Adidas apparel, but he's allowed to, because of he's kind of grandfathered into the fact that he had other sponsorships. They make an exception to the rule and allow him to add 1 or 2 extra sponsorships onto his shirt or his trunks. I think that would be the best solution. One, you'd be able to keep or bring in one of the biggest stars in the history of the UFC. You can make him happy. He's a major needle mover, and it shows goodwill. I think they should make that exception. Let him put a couple of sponsorships on his Adidas uniform, and get him into that Toronto card. I think that's the best issue, the best solution to this problem, other than spending the next year to 2 years in court fighting with one of your biggest stars in history, trying to keep him out of the ring because he doesn't really want to wear Adidas. I think there's a compromise there that should be able to be to be done. And when you look around and you say, okay, we got Ronda Rousey, she's coming back. We got George St-Pierre, and he's coming back. And then you got Conor MacGregor. This is exactly what the new ownership group of the UFC wants and needs. They're looking for needle movers. So why would you push out maybe one of your absolute biggest needle movers? When you go down the line and you look at the UFC roster and you remove Ronda Rousey and Conor MacGregor, is there a bigger star in the UFC bigger than George St-Pierre? And I would say no. Absolutely there's not. The closest star there is John Bones Jones. Those two are on that. They're kind of very, very close. But when you look around and you say, one of my favorite fighters, Daniel Cormier, he's not as big as GSP. You take a look at Rumble. He's not as big as GSP. So you go down the line and you look at all the champions. Demetrius Johnson, maybe the greatest, could be the greatest of all time. He can't move the needle even for a second, and that's a shame. It's a shame that more people don't get behind him, but he is not a bigger star than George St-Pierre. So with the new organization, I don't understand why they won't make a compromise to get one of your biggest stars back in the ring. I think at some point they will have to bite the bullet and they will have to make that compromise. If not, the decision is just to leave out one of your top 3 or 4 stars ever. I don't see that happening. I think the ownership group, I think Dana Dana White and the rest of the ownership group will make the right decision at some point. I still hold out hope that he'll make the Toronto card, but if he does, even if he doesn't make the Toronto card, I think GSP will be fighting in a UFC ring by the beginning of 2017. They would be crazy to ever let him walk out the door and go to Bellator or World Series. Well, I don't see him ever going to a World Series, but he would either go to Bellator or somewhere in Asia, like one championship or something like that. But he would never. No, I can't see him going to World Series. But you don't want a star like that to leave your doors, and I hope they get it taken care of. I think they will, and so that's my take on that one. Now, when we come back, we're going to do a roundup of the rest of the guys who are leaving, and some of them are just, but I want to talk about those guys as well. Stay tuned. I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch, whatever it may be.
Okay, I'm back, and today's card, I'm just giving you my take on. There's a whole group of guys that in the last month or so have either been forced out of the UFC, has decided to leave the UFC, let's say they haven't renewed the contract, or whatever the reason. There's a few guys that have left. The first one we talked about is the great Urijah Faber, who just announced the UFC card in Sacramento will be his last fight. And then I just covered the crazy situation that's going on with George St-Pierre and the UFC and that battle. And now I want to touch on 4 other guys who all plan on leaving the UFC, have left the UFC, and sometimes it's a good breakup. It's a decision, the fighter's decision, such as the decision with Chael Sonnen to go to Bellator. It's a frustrating decision, such as Jose Aldo making the decision to leave the UFC, and just that he's going to take some time off, or that he's no longer going to fight anymore. And then you also have guys who just been, have the UFC just decided, no, we're not going to bring you back. And that's, guys like Shane Carwin and Antonio Bigfoot Silva. So all 4 of these guys have all made plans or have left the UFC by choice or being forced. I'm going to talk about Jose Aldo first. Jose has been a legend and one of the greatest champions of all time in any sport, defending his title for pretty much a decade. And he was really I think more embarrassed by what happened between him and Conor MacGregor, and I think he made it his one singular focus that he wanted to get back even with Conor MacGregor, because Conor MacGregor kind of embarrassed him before everything by saying what he was going to do and how he was going to take the title, and then coming to the ring and knocking him out in a mere seconds. And for a guy who's been king of the mountain for as long as Jose Aldo has, that is a very tough pill to swallow. And so I feel like, if you go back and you watch, he kind of rededicated himself and really got focused, and he came back and he put on a showcase of a fight, and was crowned the interim champion. And the one thing he wants more than anything is to fight Conor MacGregor. And he was promised to get a shot at Conor MacGregor, but then the whole McGregor-Diaz situation happened. And Aldo was on record saying he was really hoping that Diaz would beat McGregor because he really wanted to get that fight. That's been his only focus. That's been his singular focus, is how do I get back to Conor McGregor? And then when McGregor beat Diaz this last time in the second fight, and Aldo was expecting to announce that it's going to be him versus Conor McGregor, but then he was surprised by the fact that the announcement wasn't him, but it was Eddie Alvarez, and that Conor McGregor was going to go for a second title. That made, I think Aldo kind of went off the deep end. I think he kind of has this whole thing. Well, promises were made to me. I'm not happy about it, and so I'm going to take my ball and go home. Guys, Jose Aldo has been a champion and has been a great fighter, and he has that right if he wants to go home. But when I listened to the interview, and he talked about the interview that he had when he actually met with the UFC brass, and he says that, it was a nice meeting. He wanted to say his piece. He wanted to hear their piece, but nothing was said to convince him that he's going to fight again in the UFC. It's everything he keeps saying. When you listen to his interviews, they're always open-ended. I don't think I will fight again. I think I'm done. It's never 100% concrete that he is 100% done with his fighting career. And the fact of the matter is, I feel like when I listen to Jose Aldo, I think it's more about saving face and being upset that Conor is actually going to fight Alvarez. I think after this, let's say Conor wins, or loses. If Dana and the UFC came to Jose and said, "You're next," which I think they will, I guarantee you, I won't guarantee, but I'm pretty confident that Jose Aldo will find himself not quite so retired. So this one is definitely to be continued. It all comes down to what happens after the Conor McGregor Alvarez fight. I personally think McGregor is going to win that fight, and it would not shock me if he did not go and try to go for a third title. Sounds crazy, but it's exactly something that Conor McGregor would do. Look at a situation where he wants to challenge the winner between Wonder Boy and Tyrone Woodley. That is one of those things where Conor McGregor is all about moving the needle and building hype. And I think if he wins both titles, and he's holding 2 titles in the ring, do not be surprised if he does not try to pull off a third title. He just fought at 170 pounds. He knows he can carry the weight. I think he's setting himself up perfectly to try to go for a third fight, which I think will make Jose Aldo's head pop off, and which is unfortunate because I think Jose Aldo, I think he should just put this McGregor situation behind him, work toward being, the champion. He's the interim champion. I think they'll eventually strip McGregor of the title. He'll be champion, and I think he could be a champion for a little bit longer. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that situation. Another fighter who has said goodbye to the UFC is Chael Sonnen. And Chael has been out of the UFC for a little while due to a drug suspension. And he's coming back. And some of the people say part of the reason why he decided to pass on going back to the UFC was because of the fact that because of USADA. And there's a number of people, writers and things that I've talked to. They're all convinced that that's the reason why he left. I mean, that's why he did not come back to the UFC. And I do think there's some truth to that. But he signed with Bellator. He's going to be fighting Tito Ortiz coming up. And I recently watched the interview on the last Bellator event that happened this past weekend. And I was excited to hear what Chael was going to say. And I wanted to hear what Tito was going to say. That was one lame interview. I was listening to him. Tito brought up the juice box and he squashed it and everything, and it was just to me, I thought it was pathetic. It didn't make me get excited about the fight. Listening to either one of them, I was just disappointed. So yes, they'll fight, and I will watch it because you have Tito, who's been around and has maybe one or two more fights left in him. Chael, I'm kind of curious to see what he has in him, but honestly, when I watched Chael fight John Jones, I felt like that was one of his last fights. I felt like Chael was on his way down then. He had the PED suspension. I feel like he put everything he had into fighting Anderson Silva, and since then I just see like I don't know what he has left in the tank. I'm very curious about that. So I'm looking forward to watching it. And I could be wrong. I don't mean any disrespect to Chael, because Chael has been one of the fighters that I enjoy listening to and watching. But I don't really look at Chael as a guy who can truly contend for the title in the UFC any longer. And I honestly think if his goal is to become a champion, I think Bellator is the right decision for him. I don't see him being a champion in the UFC, but I do see him as having a shot at being a champion in Bellator. So with that, I'm looking forward to seeing what happens. Hopefully the next couple of press conferences and next couple of interviews between Tito and Chael will have a little bit more spice than what it showed this past weekend. So I'll keep my eye out for that. And I'm going to move on to another gentleman. Shane Carwin, the former interim UFC heavyweight champion, once upon a time was one of the most dangerous fighters in the UFC. He brought rise to Brock Lesnar when he lost to Brock Lesnar to get Brock Lesnar to get the title. I was really surprised when I first heard that Shane Carwin was coming back. I thought for sure that he would be coming back to the UFC. And one of the great things about the heavyweight division is it's one of those timeless divisions. You can be, the older you get, the better you get. And when I say older, you can fight to your 40, 45 as a heavyweight and still contend. And so I thought he could actually, rack up some wins and maybe get back in the picture. And I was surprised that he wasn't able to come back to the UFC. So that was kind of a big surprise that they didn't. And that he signed this past week on his Twitter account, he put up a picture of a MMA glove, and it was a Rizin FF glove. And he states that he is signed to fight in Rizin, and get this, he signed to fight Fador, the greatest heavyweight champion of all time. Now, Fador, the last time I saw Fador was about to get knocked out by a fighter that was merely a journeyman. Fador is definitely past his prime as far as being called the greatest or the best heavyweight in the division. He's no longer that. but one thing he is a major name. And I think that's a heck of a feather in Rizin's cap, because I will definitely tune in to see a Shane Carwin versus Fador match. I think that this will be an interesting fight to see. I want to see how Fador kind of comes back after that last fight where he looked just horrible. So I'm looking forward to seeing how Fador looks. I'm very interested in seeing what happens and how Shane looks when he comes back after all the time being off. So keep your eyes peeled for the Fador Shane Carwin fight and Rizin. And then the last guy I'm going to wrap things up with today is, there's a gentleman who announced that, well, he didn't announce, they came to an agreement that he will no longer be fighting in the UFC. The UFC has decided not to renew his contract, and that's Antonio Bigfoot Silva. Now, Bigfoot has been one of the big faces of the UFC for a number of years, and he is now a free agent. And when I saw this, the UFC declined to renew his contract after fighting in the UFC for 5 years. I tip my hat to the UFC, because I think the UFC is doing the right thing. I wish the UFC, the only thing I wish, and I don't know if this was offered or not, but I would love for the UFC to have offered him or offer him some type of job within the UFC organization where he's more of a Brazilian ambassador, because he's one of the nicest guys in mixed martial arts. But I don't think he should be fighting any longer. When you look at his career, as far as his UFC career goes, it hasn't been that great, guys. He's been, when you see him, you get excited about seeing Bigfoot. And he's like I said, he's so nice. But he had a big knockout with Travis Brown, and he had a shocking knockout of Alistair Overeem. Other than that, as far as his UFC career goes, it's been one loss after another loss. There was a drug suspension in there. But when you look around, in 5 years of fighting in the UFC, and I hate to say this, I don't mean to talk bad about Antonio Silva, because he's a great guy. He's a family man, and everything I know, and everyone that I've talked to has told me how he's such a nice guy. But in 5 years in the UFC, he's won 3, he's lost 7, and 1 tie. And a lot of those 7s have come by him getting knocked out. And I think there comes a point in time where certain fighters should not fight any longer. Bigfoot is 37, and I think Bigfoot should have been done 2 or 3 years ago. I hate to say it like that, but it's true. There's a certain level of damage that a fighter can take when they start to go down. And I think he's taken too many shots, and I would like to see him give it up. But when you listen to, I believe it was his manager, and you listen to what's going on, their plans are not to stop fighting. He plans to keep on fighting, and that breaks my heart, because he's been a great ambassador, and I wish the UFC would try to step in and try to stop him from fighting by, like I said, offering him some type of ambassadorship with the UFC, because his plans are to either go to Rizin or go to Russia, but he wants to keep on fighting. And I don't know if it's a financial reason why he wants to keep on fighting, or maybe some fighters just have it in their heart and they just can't give it up. Whatever the reason, I would like to see Bigfoot call it a day and just be an ambassador. With that, I'm going to wrap things up. Once again, I'm Tate, the host here. And thank you for spending a little time with me. Remember, you can always find our shows by going to our website, which is www.goldenstatemediaconcepts.com. Thank you, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts MMA Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.